This week, the Federal Reserve said interest rates will remain close to zero in the US, probably through to 2023 at the earliest. Why? Because they don't expect inflation to pick up by then, and they expect unemployment to remain well below where it was. So they keep interest rates down to encourage borrowing, so companies expand and employ people. Then and only then will inflation pick up. That's the theory, because when unemployment gets so low, then we'll start to see wages pick up, and that's what's creating inflation. The point at which that happens is called the NAIRU. But is there such a mythical beast? And if so, why does it keep on changing? That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. So, Steve, NAIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. I suspect you're going to enjoy this episode. This is the point at which unemployment, this is the theory, unemployment becomes so low that there's a shortage of workers, so that's going to push up wages and it's going to lead to inflation. It's the point at which central banks think the economy is running too hot and they need to push up interest rates. So this is important to central banks. The only flaw in all of that argument is that nobody is entirely sure what that rate of NAIRU is, and it seems to move around all the time. And the moment everyone hits it, and nothing happens, they say, "Oh, it must be lower than that," and so it goes on. And that's a bit of a problem, isn't it? When you've got a definitive measure, but the only problem is you don't quite know what that measure actually is.
What's the character in Wind in the Willows? Is it the Will and the Wisp?
Willow the Wisp.
The Will of the Wisp, okay. It's a figment of Milton Friedman's imagination.
Yeah.
That's what NAIRU actually is,
and lots of other people, and every other central bank.
Well, no, let's give the kid who dreamt up the fantasy the first time around his due. It was Milton's dream,
right?
Because Milton was trying to destroy what he saw as Keynesian economics, which, in fact, when you look at it, was actually Samuelsonian economics that dominated America from the 1940s to the 1960s, and he, in typical Milton Friedman fashion, redefined what allegedly Keynesian economics was about. Because if you look at the way that Hicks characterized Keynes, he got him completely very, very badly wrong in the main, but there's a grain of truth to it, and that's what Hicks described Keynesian economics as the economics of depression. If you're in a depression, how do you get out of it? That was what was novel about Keynes, because initially the mainstream economists thought you couldn't get into a depression because equilibrium, therefore no such thing as depression.
Right.
Ignoring the historical experience of the 1800s, but that's another story. But anyway, you can, to some degree, without completely destroying what Keynes actually spoke about, you can say he was giving advice about how to get out of a depression.
Right.
When you have involuntary unemployment. So there's less work available than there are people who want to do the work at the going wage, and that's what Keynes uses his definition of involuntary unemployment. So people willing to work for the wage going wage, they can't get a job.
So Friedman was arguing that was only a short-term thing, though. So we only...
No, Friedman arguing it didn't exist.
Oh, right, okay.
Okay, we're back in the classical world again. He dreamt up, and this, I mean, the old hill actually, that's the word I can search for. I searched for the wrong word when I was searching through Milton before we began this podcast, so bear with me doing my usual thing of trying to do two
we'll
things
just
at
talk
once
amongst ourselves
and see if I can pull it off. But if I search in Friedman for helicopter, this is where the concept of helicopter money came up. And what Friedman did was imagine a world in which there was full employment. That's the starting point.
Right.
Okay, you have full employment, and in that fully employed world, there's 1,000 pieces of paper that are called $1 each. And those pieces of paper turn over, I think he had a rate of circulation of 12 times a year. And that turnover of money is what created the level of economic activity. And you were already starting at the point where the economy was in long run equilibrium. Okay. Everybody who wanted a job had a job.
Yeah.
Okay, you're right. And so what the government is trying to do is to push the level of employment below the natural non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Okay? Now, that's not at all what was being attempted under Keynesian policy. You said there was involuntary unemployment. You had people who wanted a job and couldn't get it. The economy was operating well below capacity. So the government, the role of the government in the broadly speaking Keynesian framework was to provide additional aggregate demand so that you eliminated involuntary unemployment.
Yeah.
Instead, Friedman starts on the point of saying you're already at equilibrium and the government's trying to drive it lower. Okay, so it's I'll let you dive into the question there, but that's the framework that Friedman began with.
Well, I mean, going back to my first question, no one actually is really quite sure what that involuntary level of unemployment is in any case, because we, in the United States, if you looked at the Fed Board of Governors, for example, if you look at the history of what their estimates are in the United States, they had NAIRU at over 7% in the 1980s. And, last year unemployment was getting down to 3.5% in the United States. Now you can argue the statistics, but I mean, the approach hasn't changed since the 80s into how it's collected. So you've got it down to 3.5%, and still inflation is not picking up. So that sort of makes you wonder about the theory behind it all, and that really is, I think, what has led to a couple of weeks ago the Federal Reserve in the United States saying, well, we're going to let the economy run hot. We're going to, we've been targeting 2% inflation. 2%. Yeah, we've been targeting 2% inflation. We'll let inflation get a bit higher than that. We'll let it get, maybe even up to 3% before we start to move interest rates. That'll allow us to focus on unemployment. That's almost an admission, isn't it, that none of this is working?
Yeah, I mean, and that's why I use the expression from the wind of the will as the will of the wisp. You're chasing something which is a figment of somebody's imagination.
Yeah,
and that's why it could never be tied down and defined, because when a physicist or an engineer defines something like mass or weight or acceleration, there's a set mechanics behind its definition which is true in the reference frame and true in general. Economists come up with these damn things, and they're fantasies. And then they try to measure what's the level of the fantasy in the real world. But of course, that never ties it down.
Right. So, but are you saying that in that case, there isn't a natural level of unemployment? There's not a point.
There isn't.
So, no. Except for zero. So,
the capitalism is a cyclical system. And this is the point which neoclassicals don't want to get their heads around, because they have this vision of reaching equilibrium. And so all the thinking is about this perfect equilibrium point. And they're ideologically biased in favor of equilibrium, because then they can say that you've reached a point where nobody can be made better off without making somebody else worse off. And that's then a social ideal. And as much as they claim to be, value free, there's ideology just through all their expressions: perfect equilibrium, optimality, etc., etc. They're trying to describe capitalism as a system which achieves some level of perfection. And you can only have perfection if you don't have cycles. Now, I could make you into something perfect. I could stop you having cycles. That would involve killing you and freezing you to absolute zero.
Right.
Would you like that?
Well, if it makes me perfect. Well,
there you go. Okay. So
I've always wanted that.
Their definition of perfection is nonsense. It's the perfection of a dead system.
Right. But I mean, the idea that unemployment is going to get so low that it's largely structural. So you've got everyone's got a job, apart from those people who are qualified as plumbers, and we've got enough plumbers. Therefore, those plumbers are going to find it hard to find work. I mean, you're going to get a point, aren't you? Which you can't get down to zero on unemployment, can you?
Well, you could by policy, things like the job guarantee idea like that. But in terms of a cyclical capitalist system, no, it's never going to stop moving. And this is, right. It isn't, this is the whole thing about NAIRU. It's supposed to be a level that doesn't change. And that's the idea of the vision of equilibrium.
Yeah.
Pardon?
Even though the central banks have been changing it every year for the last decades.
Capitalism is a dynamic system, and the vision that it reaches equilibrium is simply a fallacy about how a dynamic system behaves.
Right.
A dynamic system of capitalism is subject to external forcing. And the external forcing is that little thing in the sun that you occasionally see, sky and you occasionally see in the UK, called the sun. You're getting more acquainted with it, and as global warming comes your way. But that energy source coming in is what we all effectively mine on the planet to turn into, both life and goods and services in our capitalist economy. And we're always fighting over the distribution of income. And if you have a rise in the number of people who've got a job, there's more likely to be less people available to work, whether you have unions demanding wage rises or employers trying to steal workers from each other. You're going to get a change in that value. So it's going to be cyclical. And this whole belief that there's some stable, you're chasing something, you're trying to nail down something that shouldn't be nailed down.
Which kind of explains why they haven't nailed it down, doesn't it, really? And it's all over the place as far as the central banks are concerned. That is it for this shortened version of the Debunking Economics podcast. If you want to hear the full 40-minute version of this discussion, then you need to become a subscriber at debunkingeconomics.com or become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Do that and you can hear this in full and all the other 220 or so podcasts in this series. That's it for today. I'm Phil Dobbie. He's Steve Keen. Thanks for listening. Catch you next time.